means bad things for everyone who flies, but especially for people who fly in non-airline ways, meaning general aviation. That's a big part of the system, he says. To continue his quote, I'm worried about access. I'm worried about equitability. I'm worried about safety. Okay, pause in his quotations here. Captain Sully was the guy on safety. He would go around, and this was his job in the airlines. No man was better when it came to safety standards. For him, and then he demonstrated it that day that he knew what he was talking about. For him to make these kinds of comments, I think we need to take pause and take a step back and listen. To continue his quote, there are other better ways to solve this political budget problem. By giving the FAA and running the air traffic control system and making capital improvements to the air traffic control system more predictable multi-year funding, without giving away the keys to the kingdom to the largest airlines to control access and fees and pricing too. Mr. Speaker, I agree with Captain Sully. I think he knows something about it. Modernization. That's an area we can all agree on. American aviation would suffer terribly without the benefit of the public structure of the air traffic control system, including its accountability to Congress and the FAA. Establishing a private air traffic control company, corporation, board outside the purview of Congress with the unilateral power to collect fees without controls from the government and distribute service would threaten our national security, as I've spoken to already, accessibility and affordability of flights, not maybe immediately in the transition, but as you read H.R. 2997, it goes on to say that they can do a lot of things in a couple of years. Also, pilot generation. Look at general aviation in the examples that they use for comparisons. Many of the proponents of this bill say, look at Canada. Look at Europe. I love the Canadian people. I've traveled through most of Europe, even lived in Germany as an exchange student. Yes, in Germany today, a pilot can go from 35,000 feet in Lufthansa or an airliner, and he can glide all the way down to Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. Why? Because he doesn't have Steve Russell, Mr. Chairman, out there in his Cessna 140 in the way. Guess what? In the United States, I have as much right to airspace as a U.S. citizen flying as that Lufthansa pilot, who's, by the way, just coming here to deliver passengers, or any other airline pilot. That's the beauty of our system. What you won't find in Germany is general aviation. You won't find access. And as Captain Sully correctly stated, it's a wonderful thing. We have access to that. It's one of our hallmark freedoms in the United States. Now, when he says that we'll be handing over the keys to the kingdom, what he means is that it goes to this private corporation, this board, and then they will, for commercial interests, set up. What does that board look like? Well, here it is, right out of the bill. It will have 6 of its board members that will be on the commercial side of aviation. Now, I have nothing against commercial aviation. American Airlines, love them. They brought me home from 3 wars. I'll always have those memories. Regional carriers probably brought many folks listening to this today. But they have commercial interest, as Captain Sully correctly stated. They will be concerned about those issues. That's fine. They run businesses. They don't have to protect our national security. They fly. And so what we see with this board is 6 of them in the commercial side. Commercial, regional jets, and then you've got 1 general aviation one, and then 1 on the business side, which could support general aviation or not. But that clearly, as you lay out the board, 2 that will be appointed by the Secretary of Transportation, kind of his only say in a lot of this process, and then 2 that will be appointed by the board itself. And so what you will have is a 2/3 lopsided board that will favor the commercial interest rather than aviation as a whole. This is why Captain Sullenberger and so many others have had grave concerns about what it does to our freedoms for flying. Now, much of my protests against this bill have been because of the national security pieces. We could lay all of this other stuff aside. We have to solve these national security pieces in the bill, and right now, they're not there. And so with modernization, we can get to some of that, but we have the safest airspace in the world. Where's this broken, archaic system that we hear people saying? Canada, love the Canadians. I've driven the Alcan twice. I've been through so much of the country. Driven 1,300 miles of dirt road in Canada. Wonderful place. I've lectured in many of their cities in a former life. But Canada has the population of Texas. And if you were to look at the number of flights it handles each day, probably less flights than Texas. Yes, they have a modern system. We are having a modern system with NextGen. What we need to do is solve the acquisition pieces, the modernization pieces, not the privatization pieces. Why? We all know that much of North America's security is secured by the United States of America. They don't have to face the same things. That's why it was such a small military. It's not an indictment, it's just the truth. The bill in question, H.R. 2997, strips oversight authority of our national airspace from the President to Congress and gives it to this unelected board of individuals, an action that would threaten the United States' ability to maintain the integrity of our airspace, as I spoke to earlier, Mr. Speaker, on what goes on at altitudes and in missions that most of us really have no clue. And it puts at risk thousands of missions that our military conducts in just training and safety in our skies every day, gives private contractors access to classified data. Let's go back to what we were talking about with Edward Snowden, with the leaks that we're seeing out of the intelligence services these days. Where is that coming from? It's coming from the private contractors. It goes lateral. You think it's going to be any different because we here in Congress say, oh, no, hey, it's going to be great. This is going to be, rest assured. And I can already predict what's going to happen, Mr. Speaker. The disasters will strike. We'll sit in oversight and government reform with bony fingers and red faces going, how did you let this happen? And all we'd have to do is look in the mirror, because we're about, like dogs lapping up antifreeze, to lick up something that smells good, tastes good. Drastic consequences. If we want to maintain the safest and best airspace in the world, we have to prevent the passage of H.R. 2997. Now, this is hard for me to do. Why? Because I don't like opposing my own party. I don't like opposing my friends. I don't like opposing, I've done some terrible things in my life as a soldier. I don't like conflict anymore. I try to stay away from that as I can, and there's two veterans over here giving me thumbs up, combat veterans themselves. But I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I'm not saying if you support this bill, you're unconstitutional, or that you don't love your country, or that you don't want to protect the Republic. I'm not suggesting that at all. I have too many friends that have a counter view to mine. But it is my responsibility to expose what's in this bill and why it's dangerous and why we can't do it. And Mr. Speaker, we need to call on the American public and have them contact their members of Congress and tell them to oppose H.R. 2997, to not let privatization of our air traffic control system happen, to keep it into the role that, like Abraham Lincoln said, sometimes things that we can't do ourselves, we need to do collectively, and the government has a role in that. Mr. Lincoln obviously knew what he was talking about. Modernization, we can all agree on that. Let's work on that. Applaud the President for bringing this issue to the fore. We need to deliver that win for him. But breaching national security of our airspace and risking our safety on an unproven system is not a win. And Mr. Speaker, it's not something that we need to support.